Hello and welcome to the Business News Wales Weekly Business Review with me, Carwyn Jones, looking at all the issues that have affected the business community over the course of the last 7 days. Three guests join me again today. Katy Chamberlain. Katy, welcome.
Hello.
Ben Cottam. Ben, good to have you back.
Hi, Carwyn.
And Robert Lloyd Griffiths, who is fresh from a round of meetings. Robert, welcome.
Thank you very much. Good to see you.
Now, again, many things to discuss. On the last programme, we looked at the US presidential election, amongst other things. But today, we're going to look at the Shared Prosperity Fund and an imminent announcement by the UK government as to what it might look like. Who knows how it might operate? But we know that it'll be important because we know that it's partially meant to replace the European funding that we once had in Wales, or soon will continue to have until 2022. So what I'd like to do is to ask our guests what they think the Shared Prosperity Fund should look like. How much money should it have? How should it operate? Where should it be targeted? What are the sectors that would benefit most from that kind of funding in the future? Ben, I'm going to ask you first about your view of the Shared Prosperity Fund. I've no doubt you've been following all the news over the past few months about when and what it'll look like. If you had a free hand, what would the Shared Prosperity Fund look like and what would it do?
Well, I think it's worth reflecting that we've been waiting for some sort of picture of the Shared Prosperity Fund for the best part of 3 years now, which has been a frustration because obviously Wales is, really heavily relies on the funding that flows through, obviously at the moment from Europe to support some really important areas of economic development. And it's important for businesses to understand what activity this does support. It leverages, to some extent, services like Business Wales, which we know is really, really important. It leverages funding through Development Bank. It helps support infrastructure development. So it is very easy at the moment to get caught up, to look at it and think, well, what does it really do? But what we're talking about is really important funding that underpins a lot of opportunity for economic development. Now, to go back to your point about volume, FSB's position has been since the referendum across the UK that the same amount of money should flow to the devolved nations than that otherwise would have been expected had we remained within the European Union. Now, it does sound, at least some of the soundings from UK government sound quite positive then. I think, though, what we then move to is, well, how do we organise it, and how do we identify the priorities for that? And that's much more difficult to do because you've got the UK government saying that they would like a hand in some of that activity and some of that identification of priorities. At the moment, Welsh government administers that funding with the with the oversight of the Wales European Funding Office, operating through European frameworks. But also you've got, the extent to which we can use local government. And by principle, I think there is something really positive about, well, how do we get this funding local to identify local priorities and have businesses, third sector, public sector networks identifying, what those priorities are and having a role and some kind of role in spending that. So how you do that more effectively becomes politically quite thorny, but I think the principles, seem to be, sort of agreed by UK and Welsh governments that actually local priorities are the way to go. Now, we know, for instance, from work that we've done with our members, that where we talk about some of those local priorities, it is the state of local roads, things like that, which really concern our members, local infrastructure. So I think it'd be interesting to see where we can angle this funding to those local priorities to make sure, particularly those areas that are more peripheral from some of our urban areas, to get the benefit of this investment. But also, I think we are very, very keen to see some sort of consistency of the business supports, the business support infrastructure in Wales. We know that, it's not to say it can't be improved, but we know that this has been well performing. We know that the brand and the delivery is well regarded by businesses. And so what we want to see is a consistency there. And I think we've got a concern that might be interrupted. And actually, we've taken quite some time to build up this infrastructure and this brand. And so we'd like to see that protected. And I think now is not the time to start to throw question marks over substantive questions like that. So I guess our challenge to Welsh and UK governments, as ever, is to sit down and figure out where they can meet in the middle on this and where we can get an approach that draws together UK, Welsh and local government and other stakeholders to make sure that this money is spent as well as possible. I guess my final point is what we really don't want to see is duplication. And we see elements of that to some extent, you know, in some of the City and Growth Deal conversations. You know, there is always the danger of duplication. And I think it's important that for the limited resource that we've got, that we make sure there's proper return on investment.
Katy, here we have the UK government saying, well, this is our pot of money. We want to say how it's spent. With the Welsh government saying, well, we are in charge of economic development. We want to say how it's spent. And we have local authorities saying, well, we know what's best in our local areas. Do they have the capacity, some of them, to be able to use their powers and use their money? All these questions that need to be asked. But from your perspective, and I suppose from the perspective of most members of the public, for example, the answer would be everyone needs to work together. How do you think we can best ensure that collaboration between the different levels of government?
Well, looking at how difficult collaboration is at present with all of the various pressures at the moment, that is a really, you know, is a several billion-dollar question. But you would like to see collaboration working certainly firmly along the lines of what is devolved and what is not devolved, so that you can be very clear that money is allocated appropriately so that Welsh Government and local authorities can use it in some of the areas that are devolved and that have worked so well. I mean, going back to Ben's point about business support, you know, that's one of the areas I'd say Wales leads on and delivers very strongly on. And so you wouldn't like to see the ability of government to be able to spend on that, Welsh Government to be able to spend on that, undermined. And there are, you know, lots of other areas of devolved government that also are required. So you do need to get a good conversation happening between the UK government and the Welsh Government about how the money is allocated across the different areas. And you know, at the moment, that seems to be something that is quite a mountain to climb. Because of how difficult, you know, you have two different parties in government, and you also have the difficulties that are already happening around trying to align things for COVID. I think one of the areas that I'm also very keen not to see undermined by whatever comes out of the collaboration that we need is, you know, Wales has done a lot of work around equalities through European funds, and that is an area that has always been a high priority for Welsh Government and a very public priority for Welsh Government. And in both of my last positions, that's been quite important. When I was involved in Chwarae Teg, a lot of the work that Chwarae Teg, the Women's Economic Development Charity, did was funded by European money and has made a difference to women in Wales in terms of how they are able to engage with the economy and pursue their careers. And that's only one area of equalities where structural funds have been used in the past. So it will be a real shame to see that, you know, to see the Welsh Government unable to sort of pursue, you know, to pursue their priorities around that. I think if you can work out how things are allocated to the devolved nations, what I've seen certainly over the last few years is increasing collaboration between Welsh Government and the local authorities in Wales in terms of how local needs are addressed and things that are dealt with as national needs. And again, you can see that through some of the COVID reliefs and the way those have been dealt with. So I feel that if we can get the UK devolved nations sort of part of the pattern sorted out, I feel that within Wales, we've probably got an awful lot of the networks and the relationships, particularly now we have the various growth deals or city deals across Wales. We've probably got quite a lot of the structures that you could use to make this work on a national and a local level in Wales itself.
Thanks, Katy. Robert, we've seen in the news there's an element of friction. I wouldn't say it's an all-out battle, but an element of friction between the Welsh Government and UK Government as to how this fund should work. I mean, from your members' perspective, I suspect they just want the money to flow and for good projects to be financed. But in terms of the IOD and your members, what do you think a shared prosperity fund should look like in terms of what it should prioritise and how it should operate?
I think that the post-COVID economic landscape of Wales will dictate that we need an awful lot of help and support in a variety of areas. And I'm going to stick my neck out and agree with Ben and Katy. They've raised some really important points. Our members will see government as Welsh government, UK government, until recently European government. They don't mind where it comes from. They want governments to work together in collaboration, in partnership, with a common goal and a common purpose to do the right thing, to support communities, to support businesses, to support the economy in Wales. And I think that's the key element here. So whatever the details are, we need to spend it where it's needed. We don't need to be disadvantaged any more than any other part of the UK. We want to increase, improve, and support the economy bounce back effectively. Now, we've said on this program so many times, we are a micro business economy, and we have very limited number of the large companies here in Wales. And we are exposed if some of those big companies disinvest or close or relocate, we are severely exposed. So we want a fund that addresses those potential damaging issues, that works with local authorities, that works collaboratively between governments at all levels to ensure that the economy bounces back from this torrid time into a position where it's best able to grow and prosper. And there's lots of governments and businesses working together. There's a collaboration between governments and business working together to ensure that happens. So there will be a range of specific requests or calls upon this fund as and when we know the details. But what we do know is that we want it to work for Wales, we want it to improve the economy, and we want to build back better when the time comes.
Well, we're to see what happens with the Shared Prosperity Fund, but one issue we know has been with us for a long, long time, and it's still with us, is Brexit. We still don't know, as we sit here today, what the future holds. One issue was raised with me, actually, which hadn't struck me, and that is if we leave the single market, then there's every chance that duty-free allowances might make a comeback. And it's not just about cheap fags and beer, but it's a huge revenue fund for ferry companies. And I know they took a hit when duty-free went between Wales, the UK and Ireland back in the 90s, and no one's said anything about that. There has to be some kind of silver lining as opposed to very difficult news. But in terms of Brexit, we've explored this issue many times. We're still none the wiser. We are 6 weeks away, in effect, from leaving the EU. We don't know where we will stand. But I'm going to start with you. Brexit is happening. There's no point revisiting that. But what do your members need over the next 6 weeks in order to be able to plan better?
I think the frustration is what they need is what, politically can't be delivered at the moment, with some kind of inclination as to what a deal will look like. They need a deal. Look, we need a trade deal. Disproportionately, Welsh businesses and Welsh smaller businesses are exposed, sort of trading relationships with EU countries. So, making sure that continues as easily as possible is an absolute imperative. There's no two ways about it. I think beyond that, though, there are things that, we need some certainty as to how the immigration system is going to work. Now, obviously, one of the problems that we've got is we're moving to a system which isn't familiar for particularly smaller businesses. Points-based systems are not something that is really familiar for the majority of businesses. So they are going to, and UK government is working hard, to push out some intelligence or information to try and get people queued up to be able to engage with that, to make sure that we derive the skills that we need. But we know that there are going to be occupations which we rely heavily on, such as warehousing and haulage, which are going to mean that, we are going to have to look to the UK and to look to Wales for those skill sets in a way that maybe we've not needed to in the past, or not seen the need to develop. So we need to plug those gaps. I think that part of the problem, and it's been the problem for the 4.5 years now, is the political smoke is really problematic. And at the moment, the frustration I know among, within government, but the frustration within business as well, is that it is very, very difficult to prepare. So on the whole, we have a concern that businesses are largely unprepared. It's very difficult, though, to ask a small business that is dealing with an economic crisis, the likes of which we have never seen in our lifetimes, to ask them then to basically take a hunch on an outcome of Brexit and prepare for that, because it means redeploying resource, redeploying headspace that is difficult enough to do, and betting as to where those dice might land. So not unreasonably, businesses are sitting back and say, look, I've watched the politics for 4.5 years. We'll just watch it that little longer to see how things play out. Now, the problem with that is a lack of preparedness. And should there be no deal, then obviously that's going to have a much more significant impact on those businesses. And I suspect that where we talk about business impact, we're talking a lot about import, either those businesses that import or export. But my concern is actually that the impact is going to manifest itself through things like late payments, through things like, sort of exposure to liabilities that arise, sort of further up the supply chain. So I think the problem is that we talk to some businesses that say, well, we don't feel we will be impacted. We don't feel we have a direct exposure, but it's those indirect exposures that are problematic. And just to take that late payment issue, and a late payment crisis arising from Brexit and disruption from Brexit, alongside a late payment crisis that is already manifesting itself through coronavirus at a time when businesses are very short of cash flow, is going to be really problematic. So yes, our encouragement is that businesses need to understand their risks. And if you do nothing else, just try and understand your risks. If you do no other preparation, I think is the important message that we'd put out.
Katy, sometimes it appears to me that what we have in terms of the negotiations is busy two groups of men who are busy butting each other like stags in a rut, without thinking necessarily about what the future holds. We're very close to the deadline now. I mean, from your perspective, do you think there'll be a deal? And what do you think needs to? We know that the sticking points are things like state aid, things like fisheries. What do you think needs to be done to move things forward?
Well, I don't envy the people who are negotiating this having to do it in the full public glare, because if you think about your average negotiation, it's something that you do in private between the two parties. You have time to go out of the room and have a little think about things and then come back in again. You have an opportunity to say, oh, I need to go and check that with my dad or my boss or whatever. And it's quite a staged process. And having to do that in the full glare of public speculation and any hints that are dropped being picked up by the media, and the media desperately trying to interpret those in some way, because why wouldn't they, particularly with the uncertainty? I actually don't envy the people who are having to do this. I personally believe, I'm not sure if I'm prepared to put too big a bet on it, but I personally believe we will reach a deal, because it is in everybody's interest to do so. Although having seen that one of the members of the team has tested COVID positive, so they've had to step back from talks, I noticed earlier, did make me, if my bet is, if I was going to put one on, it's just become smaller again. I think it's probably about 50p at the moment. But then I'm a bit tight about things like that. So I feel that we will get to a deal unless time completely runs out, because it is in the EU's interest, it is in the UK's interest to do so. And however concerned we may be about this, I doubt very much if the people actually doing this have forgotten what their responsibility is. The difficulty that we see with the businesses that we're aiming to support is it is precisely that detail that businesses need. How Brexit is going to impact on different companies is all about detail and planning for that detail. So we've now got some information about the immigration system, and of course that's under our control largely, so that's easier for detail to be developed. But the areas that aren't under our control, that require detail to resolve, those are still a big concern for the clients we're dealing with. And even those who aren't necessarily exporting are still going to be impacted by talent flows, by imports, by their supply chains, and whatever happens in their supply chains. So it is a big concern. I sincerely hope that my sort of on balance, view that we get a deal will be the case. I think it will be a real concern if that's not the case.
Yeah, the two issues, thanks, Katie. The two issues that seem to be the sticking point are state aid. I mean, nobody is going to allow goods into their market if they've been subsidized to the extent that they undercut your own goods. I mean, no sane market's going to do that. The UK wouldn't do it, and the EU wouldn't do it. Yet we're stuck in that regard. And secondly, it's about fisheries, which is a tiny sector, which is utterly reliant on the European market to be viable at all, because the UK only consumes 10% of what's landed here. I mean, Robert, have we lost perspective here? Do you think that issues are being focused on that perhaps are not really that important or can be resolved, when a lot of the major issues seem to fall by the wayside, seem not to be controversial? Is that your reading of it?
That does not happen so often, and what the vast majority of business want is a deal. I think there probably will be. I hope so. I'm an optimist. Like Katie, I wouldn't put my mortgage on it or my house on it, but I think there will be. But the minutiae, majority of businesses aren't concerned with that. They're concerned with is getting something through. And it's worth reflecting, isn't it, that this time last year, we would have thought that the whole of 2020 would have been the discussion about Brexit and what happens. Here we are with a few weeks to go, and many businesses, certainly many IOD businesses and members that we look at, haven't really had the bandwidth to be able to address it in the way in which they perhaps should have done. Now, that's a fact. It's a sad fact, but there now is the urgency of finding out as much information as possible. I'm sure that Ben and Katie will concur and agree. I mean, Business Wales portal will be giving information. The UK government will be giving information via the Wales office, and the Welsh government in other aspects as well. There'll be plenty of information. Our IOD helpline has had the biggest number of calls upon it ever about Brexit. But what we need to do is to get it done, get businesses acutely aware of what the opportunities are for them, what the options are, and also the fact they just got to prepare. Bandwidth has been a real issue. Businesses have been concentrating on survival for months now, and haven't really looked to the future weeks in advance, because they just want to carry on month by month. As we go towards the end of the year, businesses will be, I'm positive, finding as much information as they can and doing what they can to make sure that their business isn't exposed in a negative way. I hope there's enough time to do it.
Thanks, Rod. Now, before we draw to a close, I'm going to bowl you all a googly straight down the track. We have a deficit in public finances, possibly the worst in 300 years. We have a UK government committed to spending £16.5 billion on defence, announced recently, on a space force. I'm glad I watched Captain Scarlet when I was a kid. But a UK government that shows no signs of wanting to make cuts, and elected on a basis of not proceeding with austerity. Now, that means, doesn't it, that the only way to plug the gap then is, yes, you can do it through economic growth, that's true, but through tax increases or new taxes. Now, you three are the Chancellor. Where do you think those tax rises or new taxes should be? What's the fairest way of raising the money? Ben?
It's a tough one. It's how you raise, how you raise taxes while not inhibiting a landscape for economic growth, which obviously then sort of helps buoy public finances. So I'm going to sit on the fence, because it is a very, very difficult, what you raise, to what level, and where you raise it is also a conversation that as a society we've not had for really quite some time. You're right, we face some really salutary conversations about how we fund recovery and how we make up for the vast investment of public finances, not least in the business community. I think the test, the challenge is how you do that, in an equitable way for society, but also in a way that doesn't inhibit growth. And there are concerns within the business community about sort of taxation that would inhibit their opportunity to grow and recover. So that isn't an answer. It's more just adding to the problem and adding to the conundrum. But that is, as far as I can see it, that is the balance that we're going to have to strike. But I'm not going to I'm not going to say that business should be, business should be exempt from this conversation. We as society have to think about, well, how do we repair this and how do we grow the economy, and what by sort of strata of society, who should bear the burden for that. So a bit of an opt-out there, but context.
Katy, you spent your life dealing with figures.
Yes, indeed. But I was very careful to avoid, I was going to be very careful to avoid tax wherever possible, but that's not what I mean at all. I was very careful to avoid working in tax wherever possible, because it was
Avoid, not evade, of course.
And I think Ben picked up on a really good point there, actually, which is that if you have to raise taxes, and that does, that has to be an obvious thing that is going to need to be considered very carefully and done, you do need to look to spread it as much as you can, and to make sure that you're spreading it in the right areas. I think Ben's right that business can't be exempt from this, but I guess I'm better at saying where I wouldn't want tax to be punitive than where I would. And business economic growth is going to be so important. We're going to have a new competitive relationship with Europe, and new new tariffs and new payments that companies have to make. So while I think business has to play its part in this, I think I wouldn't want to see us end up with a really punitive corporate tax regime. I feel that would be to shoot ourselves in the foot. Equally, you don't want to see it in taxes that are, that are regressive. Such as VAT. So you sort of come back to income tax to some extent. That's always a difficult one for any government, because of course it's all about voters. But it is going to have to come from somewhere. And I guess one of the important things, perhaps in terms of the national conversation, is starting a conversation, starting a debate about where this has to come from, and starting to manage expectations. Perhaps you and I have talked before about support for equality in the workplace, and how there are certain countries in Europe that have higher taxes and are therefore able to give better better benefits and better family friendly benefits. And the conversation I remember us having was about the fact that if you have gone there incrementally, that's okay. But if you suddenly had to say, right, I'm going to leap from this tax regime to that tax regime, that's a really tough call for a government. So it seems to me that the public debate around this, and raising that question and getting it into people's mindsets, is it's never going to be easy, and it's never going to be an easy conversation, but surely that has to be the starting point to make sure that we all recognise that the money's got to come from somewhere.
Well, Robert, we have this deficit. The old joke, isn't it, is that
death and taxes.
Everybody agrees with tax increases as long as they only affect those people who earn more than them.
Yeah.
Where do we go? We have a problem. We have an issue here. How do we look to plug that gap, do you think?
Well, many of the businesses that I speak with are struggling to survive. There are those businesses I speak with that are doing okay and that have weathered the storm. We're not over the crisis yet. We all wish that we were. Grown-up conversations are going to have to take place. Different relationships between business and governments are going to take place. But I think it was Christine Legrand who said now is not the time to talk about payback. Now is the time to help and support businesses. And I think what we need to do for the time being is continue that level of support wherever we possibly can. And I think Katy mentioned the opportunity that Business Wales and the Welsh Government have given to businesses, and also the furlough scheme and the UK government have helped. Now is not the time to say pay back. We all know that at some stage, and for however long, however many years, that will be the case. But let's have that conversation down the line. Let's not try and scupper the economic recovery for now, but it's a grown-up conversation that the relationship between business and government will have going forward. It's a tough one.
Well, I think all my guests have a great career ahead of them in diplomacy, if they wish. One of the joys of being in my position is I don't actually have to answer the question. I can just ask it, and therefore can cop out in that way. But I think we're all agreed that none of us would want to be in the position of Chancellor of the Exchequer at the moment. And it is difficult, of course, to express a view on how we plug a gap that's bound to be ahead of us. And, Robert, I think your phrase is a good one, that now it is the time to think about how to help people rather than looking more long-term at the moment. There it is. Well, that's an issue that we won't be able to resolve today, or indeed, I suspect, for the next few weeks or months. But it's been great having all three of my guests on again this week. You've been listening to the Business News Wales Weekly Business Review with me, Carwyn Jones. Join me again next week. And in the meantime, keep safe.